Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar today on applied behavior analysis, key considerations, and resources for multicultural populations. Your presenters today are Matt Roberts and Nolan Behr. Before I introduce the both of them, just want to go over a few key reminders. Please remember to mute your sound throughout the whole presentation. If you're comfortable, feel free to turn on your video. We will have a Q&A session about 5 to 10 minutes at the end of the hour. So if you have any questions or comments you would like to submit for the Q&A, please feel free to use the chat box. Like I mentioned, your presenters today are Matt Roberts and Nolan Behr. Matt is currently in his second year in the Educational Psychology PhD program at the University of Utah. His research interests include single subject research for behavioral interventions and harnessing technology to facilitate service delivery. Since August of 2021, Matt has worked in Davis School District as a behavior analysis intern, where he specializes in functional behavior assessment and writing and implementing behavior intervention plans. Nolan is currently a second-year student in the school psychology EDS program. He has experience working with adolescents and children with autism, intellectual disabilities, learning disabilities, and behavioral disabilities in residential treatment and school settings. Nolan currently works in an elementary behavioral support unit in Salt Lake City School District. Welcome, Matt and Nolan. We are very excited to have you here today. I'm going to go ahead and turn the time over to you.
Okay. Thank you for the introduction, Annie. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. All right, so like Annie said, we're going to be presenting on, we're going to look at applied behavior analysis, specifically some key considerations and resources for multicultural populations. And thank you to everyone who took some time out of their Friday afternoon to be here. All right, so I'm guessing most people here are pretty familiar with applied behavior analysis, but for any folks who aren't, and for people who view this later, we just wanted to run through just the basics of applied behavior analysis for you guys. So applied behavior analysis, it's based on the science of learning and behavior, and it helps us understand how behavior works, how it's affected by the environment, how learning takes place. And what it can do is it can help increase all kinds of skills. We do a lot of language and communication skills, but really we can pretty much do any skills that are going to help folks succeed in life. So it can improve attention, focus, social skills, memory, academics, and we can also use applied behavior analysis to help decrease problem behaviors. So one great thing about ABA is it can be adapted to meet individual needs. So regardless of age or ability, a good ABA treatment plan is preceded by a functional behavior assessment that allows us to tailor the plan to meet the individual needs of the client. Another great thing is that it's also flexible in its applicability across settings. So ABA can take place in the client's home, in schools, or on site at a community organization. Our ability to apply behavioral principles to just about any skill additionally allows ABA practitioners to teach useful skills that will benefit clients in all areas of life. And lastly, ABA can be delivered one-on-one or in group settings. Okay, so how does ABA actually work? Well, I would say most of our interventions within ABA are centered around antecedent behavior and consequence. And essentially what that is we have the antecedent that occurs before the behavior, then we have the actual behavior, and then we have the consequence. And what we can do is we can use those three things to create our interventions to help change behavior. And then what it does is it helps us understand why a behavior might be happening, and when it helps us understand how different consequences might affect whether or not the behavior is likely to occur again. And in using consequences for behaviors, the primary strategy that we implement is positive reinforcement. And so what that is rewarding the target behavior to increase the likelihood that that behavior will occur again. So a quick example of what this looks like, say we're trying to teach communication skills. So we might be in a classroom playing with some toys, and the teacher says, time to clean up your toys. The student yells no, and then the teacher removes the toys and says, okay, toys are all done. Maybe not the best strategy. So we might alternatively do something like this, where the teacher says it's time to clean up, and then that we might prompt the student to ask for 5 more minutes and then reward that behavior by saying, of course you can have 5 more minutes. And what that's going to do is that's going to help teach the kid the appropriate way to ask for more time with the toys. Okay, so what an ABA program involves is essentially 2 critical components, and these are the most important in my opinion, and just ones that I really wanted to highlight here. And those are a good behavior intervention plan and consistent data from multiple sources. And what consistent data collection allows us to see is what may or may not be working in the intervention plan and how we can adjust it to better meet client needs. So the better the data collection, the better the adjustment to the intervention, and the more successful the training will be. So looking at some additional techniques and philosophies around ABA, it's important to not just teach skills to the client, but to teach folks who surround that individual. This way the client gets to practice outside of the services they're receiving, which may only be 1 or 2 hours a week. To that same point, practicing the skills in both planned and naturally occurring environments helps facilitate the generalization of those skills. And it's really important to make sure that we're always making an effort to base our interventions around positive reinforcement. So not only is it safe and fun for clients, but there's tons of research demonstrating the effectiveness of positive reinforcement as opposed to, say, punishment. Lastly, making sure that we are withholding reinforcement instead of punishing. So, for example, if a child starts crying, a not so great response would be to yell at them or provide some kind of negative interaction. Whereas alternatively, the best thing to do in this situation might be to simply wait for the behavior to stop and then reinforce them stopping that behavior with a positive interaction. So that's what that might look like. So for the people primarily practicing applied behavior analysis, it's going to consist mostly of BCBAs and RBTs. And for the folks who aren't familiar, BCBAs they typically supervise RBTs who work hands-on with the kids in behavioral settings. BCBAs work hands-on with kids as well, but there's a supervisor-supervisee relationship there too. But it can also be applied in multiple settings. So we as behavioral practitioners might find ourselves training teachers, parents, and other caregivers the skills to implement treatment plans on our own. Or on their own, sorry. Okay, so before we move into some of the research, we wanted to address some common issues that folks take with applied behavior analysis. And we found this discussion on Child Mind. They offer a great discussion of both sides of these arguments, and I've included the link here. And so if you're interested in learning more about this or reading this discussion that they posted, feel free to shoot us an email and we can send you these slides. So it is true that punishment was used in the early days of ABA, but this is no longer the case. And as I've said before, punishment is essentially the opposite of reinforcement. So you're actively doing something that's going to decrease the behavior. And this still occurs a lot today, especially in settings that I work in. I spend a lot of time up in Davis School District, and unfortunately, it's still pretty common practice for teachers to take away recess as a form of punishment for behavior. And research actually shows now that that can actually have the opposite effect. It can actually increase challenging behaviors. But that does still occur pretty commonly, and especially in educational settings. So these next 2 criticisms, they're very valid and important criticisms of ABA if ABA is not implemented correctly. So to address these, when we are teaching kids new skills using ABA, it's important that we ask ourselves, if we are correcting a challenging behavior, is it a behavior that actually impairs their functioning, or is it something that someone decided was inappropriate? So we need to always be making sure that we're teaching skills that will help the client be successful rather than trying to make them fit a mold or fit neurotypical norms. So a common example of this would be like stimming behavior. So if a teacher wants to say that the stimming is inappropriate for their class, we might ask the teacher, is it actually impairing their functioning? And if it's not, then why should we try to force this neurodiverse individual to meet neurotypical standards? So just an example of that. And aside from ABA being well-researched and evidence-based, ABA should really be meant to help individuals succeed. All right, so now Nolan's going to go into some of the literature. It's a bit limited, but we've got some good articles that he's going to talk about.
All right, thanks, Matt. Yeah, as he said, we have a few resources, but yeah, we had to dig a little bit for it. There's not a lot out there. So we found some articles. There's some resources that were sent to us by Dr. Ann Fisher and Dr. Alicia Horner. So we do have a few people coming together on this, but yeah, we will hit some of these things, and I'll just touch on them fairly briefly for the sake of time. But if you want to look up these for yourselves, obviously here's the title and the author information and year. But we can also, if you reach out, we can also get you these articles and these other resources as well. So don't hesitate to reach out if that's something that might interest you. So this first article, Multilingual Diversity in the Field of ABA and Autism. So it's a brief review and then discusses future directions. So this article essentially addresses multilingual diversity within ABA as it specifically relates to the treatment of autism spectrum disorders. The authors hone in on the fact that the US is a multicultural melting pot, and the cultural and linguistic diversity are only increasing, making it essential that we address these issues within the field of ABA. They go on to talk about how the role of multilingualism in ABA treatment for autism has rarely been addressed in research or in practice. And these factors are very likely to impact the ABA treatment process significantly. So they feel that it's really important for us to touch on these things and to continue to advocate and to push these things. The article goes on to discuss how multilingualism might be better addressed within the field of ABA within some of the things that the authors suggest. They do this through a review of the existing literature and specifically address various multilingual approaches when using ABA and discuss, like the name suggests, directions for future research. They end by suggesting future directions for the field, some more applied aspects of what this research is suggesting, and specifically talk about increasing the number of international students in graduate programs, enhancing the diversity curricula within graduate programs and continuing education, and other efforts by professional organizations to address diversity. We can hop to the next article. All right, so building a social justice framework for cultural and linguistic diversity in ABA. So this article talks a lot about how ABA may be in a pretty unique and special spot to have a significant impact with cultural and linguistically diverse client populations. They talk about this opportunity not only because of ABA's growth and increased social acceptability, as Matt was kind of hinting, since initial and early views of ABA, but also because certain practitioners in ABA are increasingly working in the education system. So a few different areas to access students and not just these outside agencies, though they obviously play a big role as well. And they talk about making others aware of different ABA technologies and how this depends on the advocacy and how we can aim to close these research to practice gaps. The authors believe that social justice is both an approach and a framework, and they go on to describe how to apply these social justice guidelines, specifically when working with culturally and linguistically diverse students and their families. They go on to highlight culturally relevant considerations that can be included in research, training, and service delivery. So they try to touch on a few different aspects. Because, yeah, like I was talking about, they really value and want the field of ABA to value the push towards applying these things and not just having them be theoretical in nature. They specifically suggest that behavioral analysts consider it an ongoing objective to engage in culturally informed assessment, culturally and linguistically relevant intervention, culturally focused advocacy and collaboration with families, and use self-assessment of their cultural competence. So just a lot of checks and supports, both for the professionals administering and helping support these families and their kids, but also just ways that the field in general can move forward stronger, especially in these areas that are so important. We can head to the next article. This article specifically touches on the Latinx population and increasing access and quality of behavior analytics services for this population. And I think it's really interesting because this article starts with some helpful statistics and highlights that Latinx individuals are the largest minority group in the United States, making up approximately 18% of the population, the total population. And they go on to highlight that this number will increase to somewhere around 28 to 30% by 2060. So it's definitely an extremely relevant topic, and I think really exciting too, as we discover and talk about the increasing areas of diversity and how we can serve more populations. So although there is an immense need for behavioral healthcare systems to provide services to the Latinx community, these authors talk a lot about how access to these quality services can and do continue to be lacking for Black, Indigenous, and people of color populations or BIPOC communities. The authors look into some of the cultural and language factors that should be considered when implementing behavior analytic services by these providers, and suggest that these providers have a shared responsibility to make culturally and linguistically appropriate services available to these populations, because they're often the populations that obviously need services as much, if not more, than other populations, but have the least amount of access and availability to those things. And so trying to push for more equitable service delivery. They'll also talk about recommendations for systematic action across service providers, other professional organizations, behavior analytic training programs, and then they talk about these things and how researchers can address the various barriers that these communities face. And obviously these aren't light or short conversations or answers, but they do attempt, and I think do well at trying to provide some comprehensive and intentional, well thought out arguments or conversation points to talk about a lot of these things, which is refreshing and I think obviously necessary as we want to talk about long-term change and solutions. Okay, we can go on to the next one. So the Multicultural Alliance of Behavior Analysis Standards for Cultural Competence and Behavior Analysis is an article, but it essentially talks about a few of the standards and guidelines that have been and continue to be implemented as far as cultural competence is concerned. Obviously, there's a variety of different ways that people talk about culture and individuals' awareness or sensitivity toward it. And so I think that obviously those things can be put in place of cultural competence if individuals wish to do so. But I think the push towards doing this in the field is obviously what's ultimately important and how we can be better about our approaches. And so they talk about how clinicians need to ensure that they are properly educated and aware of various cultural competencies or to be culturally sensitive. And the authors then also go on to say that though there have been guidelines established for responsible conduct, there is yet to be standards to ensure that cultural competence is sustained again for the long term in the field of behavior analysis. Obviously, as you can go through the various codes of ethics and standards and things like that, there have been some more recent updates that touch on some of these aspects, more intentionally worded and intentionally placed guidelines and things like that, which is really good to see. And obviously, we only hope that they continue in this direction. But yeah, obviously there are still things that should be done and need to be done, but we also want to acknowledge the things that have been done and the current progressions that are happening. Okay, go ahead, Matt. This is a really unique article that talks about how behavior analysts can help the general population and obviously ourselves and within the field understand and reduce racism. And they talk about this in light of the current literature that exists. And again, obviously not a ton is available, but I think again they do a pretty good job of touching on these things with what does exist, and then try to suggest how we can apply and continue forward with the work that's already been done and not to just leave it here. And so obviously, despite these ongoing efforts to end racism, it continues to negatively affect education, mental health, community relations, and economic development. And so the authors suggest that every behavior analyst can and should contribute to the reduction of racism in some way, wherever they're at, however they can do that. They understand that not all actions or stances or things like that are going to be these big grandiose things, but obviously we also don't want to discredit the here and now things that we can do every day to take our steps towards doing what we can to understand and reduce racism. The article proposes ways that members of the scientific community can learn about racism, specifically from a behavioral analytic perspective. And they extend experimental analyses of prejudice, and they talk about intervening to reduce racism in various settings. Again, kind of touching on where people are at and what they might be able to do with where they currently are situated. The article goes on to describe both traditional behavior analytic and functional contextualist accounts of racism, and essentially summarizes the related empirical and applied research that exists within these contexts. The review then suggests that combining traditional behavior analytic methods with the acceptance and commitment training techniques that we're seeing increased in various settings may impact this discussion of how we can end racism more effectively. The article ends with a call to collaborate, specifically globally, around such an important issue that obviously we see a lot of impact here in the United States, but as we look across different regions and different countries, it's not an isolated issue. And so they talk about what we can do globally to address these things and how we can reduce racism in our different contexts. Go ahead, Matt. So this next one is not necessarily an article, it's more of a resource guide and how we can develop culturally responsive approaches when we are serving diverse populations. And so the initial goal of this resource is to help community-based service programs more easily find and access available resources on cultural competency so that they and we can better serve our targeted populations. The resource guide also aims to help community-based organizations attract funding and people who can support them financially, which often requires evidence of culturally competent programs if you want funding for these various things, especially when attempting to receive federal funding, things like that. People and organizations want to know what these agencies are doing and what they can show to demonstrate the steps that they're taking in these areas. The authors of this guide do talk about how it's not intended to serve as like a training resource, but rather to direct users essentially to an existing realm of valuable tools and various resources that they can consult. They can use them, and the authors encourage the adaptation of these resources so that these agencies can strengthen their capacity to provide more culturally competent or sensitive service delivery programs so we can reach more members of the community. The resource is also intended to support these community-based organizations in developing high quality and successful applications in response to the funding announcements that they might receive. So putting action behind the things and following up with the aims that they're hoping to see within their agencies and within their communities. Okay, go ahead, Matt. And so our last resource here is actually a textbook, which is Multiculturalism and Diversity in ABA. And it really talks about the effort to bridge theory and application. So again, we're trying to narrow this research to practice gap, because obviously this research that we do is important. We hope that it continues to happen. Obviously, the existing authors and current professionals hope that their work spreads and things like that. But ultimately, we need to be able to apply these things in our communities, into the areas that we're in, so we can actually truly implement change and advocate for the people that we're trying to serve. And so, again, this textbook and its authors in it talk about how they are not intentionally creating a training resource or anything, but they also are hoping to provide more resources that individuals, both teaching and just learning about this topic, can consult with, that they can bring to their workplaces, bring to their agencies, bring to their communities. And then again, similar to the last resource, they really want to provide this to people so that we can create better services for the communities that we're trying to support. This book talks a lot about these various, obviously, areas that you see on the screen here, different important facets of what ABA is and what it hopes to be, how it's developing and changing. And specifically, you'll see some areas in here that are how behavior analysts specifically can improve the services they do. And so it talks about supervision. It talks about how we can implement proper and socially valid parent training, how professionals in ABA can become more culturally aware and addresses lackings in this area in the past. It talks about just cultural complexities in general and things that are maybe misunderstood and things that we're trying to understand and advocate for as we continue on with this work. And then it specifically talks about some of, again, more of the standards and the guidelines that the BACB or the board in behavior analysis is trying to implement to create widespread and lasting change. And so these are just a few resources that we found and were provided with. Like I said earlier, if you want more information about any of these things, obviously feel free to reach out. And so now we will transition into talking about how we can use these things how we can use these things and transform them into application to our practice and working with these different populations.
Yeah, so thanks, Nolan. Yeah, those are some really great resources. And a lot of those resources do talk about best practice for working with these populations too. But one article that we really wanted to highlight here is this article that it was Dowdy and colleagues in 2021. And in this article, they present a checklist for working with an interpreter. So it's pretty well known that there are not a lot of mental health professionals who are bilingual or speak Spanish, for example. But one thing that practitioners can do is work with an interpreter. And that can be that can be really successful, but it can also be detrimental. So it's important to adhere to best practice when you're using an interpreter. And that's why we really appreciate this article, is because they provide a checklist that BCBAs and interpreters can review together before and after client sessions that help both the interpreter and the BCBA adhere to cultural norms and all sorts of good things. And they also highlight some key considerations when working with an interpreter too. So I'm going to walk us through a few things in this article. Again, this is a great article, and I think it's really applicable to working with multicultural populations, especially given that there's just not a lot of practitioners out there that speak other languages. So believe it or not, practitioners are actually legally required to use an interpreter when working with non-English speaking clients. And so here's some of the legality there. So in Title VI of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, it provides the right to an interpreter during healthcare related conversations for clients who have limited English proficiency. And then we have the Bilingual Education Act of 1968. And that mandates full access to educational opportunities for language minority students. And then we have the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act in 2004, which requires the Individualized Education Plan, or the IEP, to be written and reviewed with families of limited English proficiency in their native language. And then lastly, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services requires healthcare providers who receive federal funding to offer access to ELL clients. So a lot of legal stuff here that does require us to work with interpreters, so it's important that we know how. Okay, so these are some of the key practices that are outlined in this article. We're just going to go through each one. So, and again, these are key practices to guide the BCBA interpreter collaboration. So the first one is to unpack jargon. And I think the biggest one here, at least for me, is acronyms. And even me as an English speaker coming into this field, there were just so many acronyms to unpack and memorize. And so you can imagine someone who speaks little to no English, and they're coming into this IEP meeting and they're hearing ADHD, IEP, BCBA. So really important to it's really important to unpack those acronyms when you're working with an interpreter. And then to speak in simplified sentences is really important. And in the article, they gave this example that I like to point out. So I'm going to give you two sentences and you'll be able to see which one is better to use with an interpreter. So the first sentence is, we will conduct an interview informed, synthesized contingency analysis and may implement functional communication training along with extinction to address the problem behavior. Now, any of us that are in the BCBA program or have some familiarity with behavior practice probably know what that means. But I mean, even for me, I have to think about it a little bit. But for anyone else, they're probably going to have no idea what that means. So the second sentence is, we will conduct an assessment to determine the reasons the behavior occurs to help us determine why your child does the behavior. So a little bit simpler, but I think even that second sentence, you might need to repeat it or unpack some of those words as well. Okay, the next one is to allow more session or meeting time. So obviously when you're working with an interpreter, things are going to be said more than once. And so always allow for extra time in the meeting. So if you have a 30-minute IEP meeting with no interpreter, then that same material is going to take much longer when you're working with an interpreter. So be prepared to set aside, the article recommends about 30 minutes extra for working with an interpreter. And then next is to communicate directly with clients. So this just means to face and speak directly to the client rather than the interpreter. So if the interpreter is sitting next to the client, you don't want to be just talking to the interpreter. It just takes a lot of the authenticity out of it, I think. So to that same point is to consider positioning. You really want to avoid the interpreter triangle where you have yourself sitting there and the interpreter off to the side and then the client on the other end of the triangle. Because then you just kind of get this weird back and forth dynamic with the interpreter, and it just feels like both of you are talking to the interpreter instead of talking to each other. So what you might do is either have the interpreter sit next to or behind the client to encourage that face-to-face interaction between the BCBA and the client. And lastly is to understand the role of the interpreter. And this article outlines 4 main roles that the interpreter may have in a session. And the first one, and the primary role, is going to be the message converter, which is the person responsible for relaying the message or to the client or the provider. And the second one is the message clarifier. And so the interpreter may need to interrupt to ask for clarification or be an advocate for the client to clarify things as well. The third one is the cultural clarifier. So the interpreter may need to interject to explain a cultural norm. And then I mentioned this one, but the fourth one is the client advocate. So if the interpreter believes that there's been a misunderstanding, it's the interpreter's job to represent the client and be an advocate for them because the client may not know and may need an advocate for clarification. Okay, so after they outline some of these key considerations, they move into the actual checklist. And it's broken down into 2 sections. The first one is the pre-interpretation meeting. So this is where the BCBA and the interpreter, just the client's not involved in the pre-interpretation meeting. So the BCBA and the interpreter get together before the meeting, and they go over these questions, and it's organized into sections. And so items 1 and 2 are designed to review the expectations. And so here, the BCBA and the interpreter are describing each other's expectations prior to the session, and that allows for the focus of the session to be on the client receiving the services rather than an understanding of expectations between the behavior analyst and the interpreter. It just allows more time for the client to get the service. 3 and 4 are looking at cultural differences, and then 5 and 6 gives them some time to review material from previous sessions. So once they move through the pre-interpretation meeting, then they have the session, and then the post-interpretation meeting, this is where the client can be involved, and it really helps when getting client feedback too. And having this post-interpretation meeting, it allows the major issues to wait until the end and not take away from valuable service time. I'd be willing to guess that all of us have been in a meeting where someone gets hung up on something, or there's some sort of issue that ends up taking more time than anticipated. And then before we can get to the important stuff, time runs out. So this post-interpretation meeting, it allows, if there is a major issue, we can say, okay, let's save this for the post-interpretation meeting, and let's move on to some of the important topics that we're here to talk about. But this is broken down as well. So questions 7 through 9 allows the group to talk about some of the communication barriers that may have arose in the session. And questions 10 and 11 give the group a chance to reflect on the cultural norms. And then 12 to 15 is a chance for session feedback. And this can be from the BCBA and the interpreter, but even more importantly is a chance to get feedback from the client. Okay, so now what we'll do, we're going to change gears a little bit and highlight some of the local resources. Unfortunately, being in Utah and in Salt Lake, there are not a lot of resources that explicitly advertise that they serve non-English speakers. But we were able to find a couple that are working towards that. And so they have some Spanish speaking employees that are able to accommodate some of that too. So I've put links to all of them here. At the top is just the directory for finding local ABA resources that is provided by Autism Speaks. And so this is a really good way to find ABA resources in your area. And I'll move through each of these individually, but I've included the links here. And again, if you're interested in having these links, we'll have our emails at the end of the slideshow, so feel free to reach out. So first is the Pingree Autism Center of Learning. And this place specializes in children and adolescents on the autism spectrum. They utilize ABA strategies. It's evidence-based. It's located in Salt Lake. And according to Autism Speaks, they are making attempts to accommodate Spanish-speaking individuals, which I thought was really cool. And then they accept Medicaid insurance and private insurance as well. Okay, next is Utah Neuropsychological Services. This is in Salt Lake City, and this is run by Dr. James Noor. They do mainly evaluations, but they also help formulate ABA-based treatment plans, and they also do consultations to help connect families to community services, schools, and employers. Okay, next is CTR Supports, Community Therapy Resources. This is down in West Jordan. They don't do direct ABA therapy, but they do help connect neurodiverse folks and their families to ABA resources and other resources at home and at school and the community. So they do a great job helping folks get in touch with the resources they need. And the nice thing about CTR Supports is that it's a nonprofit, and so they'll see clients at no cost, but they also accept Medicaid insurance and private insurance as well. Okay, so Fabian House, this is down in Lehigh, and this is another one of those that says they are accommodating Spanish-speaking individuals, which, if I had to guess, means that they have some employees who know some Spanish or are fluent in Spanish too. So we thought that was really cool. But they combine one-on-one motivational learning techniques with an early childhood education curriculum to try to meet goals within the context of your typical educationally rich classroom. Okay, so this was on our slideshow, and this morning I went into their website to try and find some more things on them, and it actually says on their website that as of August 2022, last year, they are no longer providing ABA therapy or autism services. So I wanted to keep this slide on here so that I could mention that, because if you look at some other websites online, they'll list this as a resource for folks who need service for ABA or anything else. But yeah, I just wanted to include that here. And what they've done is that Kids Who Count, they've partnered with a local agency, a trusted agency that has the similar principles. And so they pointed us in this direction, Whole Child Therapy. This is down in Spanish Fork, Utah. And they specialize with individuals on the autism spectrum. And what they do is they combine 4 therapies in an integrated model. And so they do ABA behavioral therapy, speech and language therapy, occupational therapy, and mental health therapy. And they run them separately, but they do them all with individual students. And so they just have employees for each of those modalities. And what that does is it allows people to go in and get service for all of those things in one location, which I think is pretty cool. Okay. So, Nolan, take it away.
All right. So yeah, kind of as Matt was talking about, the resources on the local agencies that we found none of them were explicitly multilingual agencies. And again, these are the ones that we found. So there's a possibility that they exist, that we just were unable to access their information. But yeah, again, as Matt talked about, some of these agencies are making steps to accommodate and support multilingual individuals by hiring bilingual professionals, offering assessments in various languages and things like that. And so I think our hope, as we see some of these agencies, is that these can be a segue to continue conversations and other advocacy efforts, whether that's the continued expansion to various languages and cultures in these agencies, obviously hoping that just additional resources and supports become available through additional agencies or other community resources. And yeah, we appreciate the things that are happening in our community, but we also realize that we still have some room to grow as far as these things are concerned. I did find one agency that was explicitly like a bilingual behavioral service agency. They are based in Virginia, so if you ever find yourself out there, you can see if they can provide some services. But yeah, here in Utah, I think partially because of the cultural setting that we're in and just some of these other reasons, yeah, there aren't a lot of resources available, but obviously we hope to see that continue to change and grow. And maybe, you know, some of our community members and people that are passionate about these things can help lead and help support these efforts. So I just want to leave us with a few questions, specifically like related to ABA, but I think you can expand them to whatever your context is, just as we go off, and continue to think about and why these services and these populations are so important and kind of what we can continue to do. And so again, specifically for the behavior analytic context, these questions are: how would you define socially appropriate behaviors? How well are we in behavior analysis doing in terms of cultural humility when we interact with multicultural clients? What are we as a field doing to promote diversity and cultivate culturally humble behavior analysts? And the last question is just, how can you adapt these questions to fit your context? And I think personalizing those to where you're at, who you're with, what your contexts are, really helps us understand the people that we're hoping to reach, and the services that are necessary, and just the changes that we hope to see in our communities. So I just want to leave you with those questions, and now I think we are going to open it up for any questions or comments if anybody has any.
Thanks, Nolan. Any questions, you guys?
I do. I got a question. That was fantastic, by the way.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you think that this is something that can be governed at a national, large-scale level, or is multiculturalism in an ABA context better managed at a local level with local populations and various groups?
That's a
Makes
great
sense.
question. Yes, I think so. You're asking if we should put our focus on the national level as far as working with multicultural folks, or if we should just focus on implementing things at more of a local level. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. I mean, Nolan, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this one too, but I almost think that it would be better off at more of a local level, just because I think that there's less moving parts, and I think just in terms of efficiency and effectiveness, when you have less moving parts and you're in more of a localized setting, it can be easier to roll out interventions or best practice recommendations, things like that.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Garrett. That's a really good question. I think obviously the end goal in a perfect world is that we would be able to implement some national things in this regard. Obviously, as we learn more about legislature and all these things, especially the things that are currently happening, we know that there are just so many layers to these things. And so, yeah, I think that's a great question and a great thing to advocate for. And I don't think we should not advocate for things on a national level in fear that they won't succeed as much as we hope. But I think I would agree with Matt in a sense that I think we really need to pour into where we are locally and who we can support. And hopefully that grows. Hopefully it gains traction from other providers or other states, things like that, even other cities, obviously, within Utah. I think, again, ideally, there could be a ripple effect, but obviously, without knowing exactly when or where, how to implement these things. I think the core and the local support that we can gain will really help those things. I also do want to be cognizant of the fact that like the BACB, the board does have standards that all practitioners have to abide by. And so they do, just we touched on just briefly, but there's obviously more information you can get as far as specifics, but there are standards and guidelines and things like that that are aiming to promote things in these areas, the areas of cultural sensitivity and supporting multilingual individuals and their families and things like that. So I don't want to miss those or omit them, because I think they are trying, but obviously then we need to talk about how to make sure that the implementation is happening with fidelity, and how we assess whether the board or whether these things are succeeding, right? Because obviously that could vary a little bit depending on obviously the things like the state you're in, the agency you're in, who you're working with, just so many layers. But yeah, I think that's a really good question, and hopefully we can continue to see some progress, whether it's locally or obviously, like we talked about, ideally nationally.
Well said. That's what I was trying to say, but no one said it for me.
Gotcha, man.
Any other questions? Okay. All right. Well, I'll let Annie take it from here. But again, thanks for folks who could make it out this afternoon, and for folks on YouTube, thanks a lot for watching.
Yeah, we appreciate
it. Before we leave, just one big virtual round of applause for Matt and Nolan for a great presentation today. If there are no other lingering questions or comments, we will go ahead and conclude today's webinar. Again, thank you everybody so much for joining us. This presentation is recorded and will be uploaded to the UTTEC Lab website and YouTube channel. So please feel free to check it out there. And for information on future webinars, as well as content, you can access that by going to the UTTEC Lab website, by going to u-tteclab.com. Again, thank you everybody so much for joining us, and hope you have a great weekend.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care.